Welcome back. This is the the final podcast of the five that looks at the Nazi economic policy 1933 to 39. In the previous podcast, we looked at the impact of the new plan and the four-year plan on the working classes. What we're going to do in this podcast is focus on two other social classes, which we're going to focus in on the farmers and the businesses. So we're zooming in just on this particular strand here. You'll notice that I've called it the supporters of the Nazis, just to give it a heading. I think the general feeling with the working classes was that many workers tentatively, cautiously supported the Nazis in the early years, 1933 to about 1936, but then increasingly the working classes became disillusioned with the Nazis. When it came to the farmers and the businesses, their support was a bit firmer, and for many of them it did continue, particularly for the businesses, throughout and into World War II, but the farmers less so. So again, I think it's important not to kind of like talk in black and white terms on this in the exam. Use sort of more cautious words. To some extent, the farmers supported the businesses, but as the years went by, many became disillusioned. That sort of language is the way in which you should talk. Just again to remind you of the social pyramid. I mentioned this in the previous podcast. If you imagine society as a pyramid with the people in power at the top, there are less of them, which is why the pyramid is drawn that way. We said that the working classes are the group at the bottom. Okay, the larger group. That's what we looked at in the previous podcast. What we're doing here is we're focusing more on the middle classes. Okay, businessmen, for example, are middle class. They have risen from their lower class roots. They've got their own business. They are making profit. They have more wealth and more influence. And the same with farmers. Farmers are in a sense, are the businessmen of the countryside. They own land, for example. So I think possibly as a starting point, remember this point. The businessmen and the farmers, one of the main reasons they supported the Nazis was because the Nazis, very early on, 1933, crushed communism. Okay, if you're a businessman or a farmer, in other words, if you own property, if you own business, if you own a farm, if the communists had taken power in Germany, the businessmen and the farmers would have lost that. Because communism is about taking the wealth from the rich and distributing it equally amongst the poor. Let's get into the details then. Okay, so farmers. In fact, the first point I've got here is a very distinctive feature, and this is a feature that the examiners will like if you mentioned it. Many farmers had supported the Nazis before 1933, so they backed Hitler into power, big voters for the Nazis in 1932 and 1933, because the Nazis consistently put across a message that they valued the farmers because of what we call blood and soil. Now, what this basically means is the Nazis always claimed, as we know, the Nazis were racist. Okay, and the Nazis always claimed that the best German blood came from the people who lived in the countryside. So the Nazis always talked up the farmers, the peasants, people who had jobs in the villages in the countryside. The Nazis in their propaganda, and you can look at this here as a typical Nazi painting, would often emphasise that the best Germans were those who lived in the countryside because they were breathing in good fresh air. We'll do more about this with family policy in the final, in the penultimate revision sessions. So Hitler Youth, for example, they would gather together in the cities and then they would go off for hikes in the countryside. And the Nazis believed that was important. Next point: some farmers definitely benefited from Nazi policies. Okay. The RAD schemes that we've looked at when we did about Schacht and the new plan. Okay, remember the RAD was the German, the national service scheme, where all men between the ages of 18 and 25 had to do 6 months service They often went into the countryside to drain swamps, which could be turned over to farming land as part of the scheme for making Germany self-sufficient. Well, farmers benefited from that. Okay, it was cheap labour for them when sort of detachments of workers came from the cities out into the countryside. Farmers, of course, would employ labourers. Well, they appreciated the fact that the wages were kept low by the regime. So those were reasons why many farmers supported the regime. However, it was not a black and white picture. Many farmers lost workers to the factories. Okay, and again, this was particularly from 1936 onwards. Try not to talk about this topic as say in black and white terms. Early on, 1933 to 36, this was not a problem, but from 1936 onwards, once the four-year plan really kicked into gear, the big emphasis was on move to the cities, work in the factories, make weapons, and that's what we call the flight from the land. I mean, many farmers lost their labourers because they were conscripted. They were forced to join the army from 1935 onwards. So farmers were increasingly struggling from 1936 onwards, and so many farmers who supported the Nazis in the early years increasingly became disillusioned with the Nazis. Let's move on to businesses. Businesses are a really interesting example. Okay, so a bit like the farmers, in the years to power, in other words, the years, let's say 1929, the Wall Street crash, up to 1933 when Hitler became Chancellor, businesses were big backers of the Nazis. Okay, they had supported the Nazis into power. Why? Because Hitler, in his campaign promises, had promised to crush communism. Okay, and he in particular put a big emphasis on protecting the small traders. So when we say small traders, let's say for example in retail, you've got department stores and then you've got small shops like your small grocery shop, etc. When we say small traders, we don't mean the department stores, we mean the small shops, the small grocers, etc. Nazism, to a large extent, in its early years, represented the small traders, the small businessmen. And so they were very attracted to the Nazis. Many Nazi Party members were small shopkeepers, small craft makers, people like that. So, again, like the big businessmen, very much attracted to the way Hitler promised to crush communism, because if the communists had taken power, and remember in 1933 many people thought they would, then the first thing the communists would have done would have been to distribute wealth evenly, which would have taken all the wealth away from people who owned their own businesses. There would have been no such thing as private ownership of businesses. Wealth would have been shared amongst the people. Now, Hitler took power, he crushed communism very quickly. Remember, we did that it was what we call Gleichschaltung coordination. Communism was crushed in the first few months of 1933. That just simply confirmed in the minds of the businessmen, as it did with the farmers, that the Nazis were good for business. Okay, so they benefited from Nazi economic policies. Other things, and we'll do this when we do racial policy, Jewish businesses were closed throughout the 1930s, and the wealth of that was given to small businesses and to big businesses. But it was big business who benefited most from the regime, okay, from the system, from the Nazis taking power. Why? Well, no trade union problems, we've done that. Trade unions were banned. Therefore, there was no right for workers to go on strike to campaign for better pay. Well, that's going to benefit you, particularly if you're a big business. Why big business? Because if you're a big businessman, you've got lots of workers working for you. And yeah, if the Nazis are basically saying, well, those workers have got no right to campaign for decent wages, well, that basically is going to increase your profits. As long as you spend your profits to make weapons, okay, you will continue to make yourself rich. So rearmament, as long as you worked for rearmament, and with Goering coming to power, taking power or taking control of the economy in 1936 onwards, there was a clear message: if you make weapons for the regime, then you do need to. If you make weapons for the regime, then you need then you will benefit. Okay, you will prosper, and they did. Okay, so big businesses could and did prosper, but only if they followed Nazi orders and geared their business towards war production. Okay, many small businesses, this is why you need to make these distinctions, like the small shopkeepers though, small craftsmen, couldn't compete. The big businesses, the big factories that made the weapons increasingly were more efficient because they had what we call economies of scale. They could invest in new technologies, etc. And so many small businesses over time actually just went under, and they couldn't exist. So again, there's that sort of small businessmen lost faith in the regime earlier, but big businessmen, as long as they worked for the regime, they did well. And thus this particular picture here, which was taken at the end of the war, of the Nazi businessmen, of businessmen who worked with the regime, helping the Nazis, these big businessmen at the end of the war were tried as war criminals, okay, because they were accomplices, they were complicit in supporting the regime. Where did the gas chambers, where did the ovens, etc., come from for the Holocaust? Well, they were made by big businessmen who saw profit by working with the Nazis. So in the end, they did not benefit in the end, and that's the key point to make. So there is your factual test, as before. Make sure you improve your knowledge, play that frequently, make flashcards, put them on your wall. The answers to this factual test are on the next slide, so pause this podcast and then review your answers. But keep coming back to it, keep improving your knowledge. There are the answers. Just a reminder, okay, there are 2 walk and talk podcasts where I walk and talk you through past questions. The first one there was a 12 marker, that's 18 minutes, about how the Nazi government reduced employment, and the second one is an essay question about debating whether the Germans benefited from rising living standards. Make sure you play those podcasts. It tells you the structure of the answer. Learn the structure, learn the topic sentences, and again, there's more information in those answers than what I've covered in these 5 podcasts, so I'm just giving you more detail. Especially important for reaching those high grades A star and A. Okay, thank you very much. Hope that was useful for you.